3 forgotten murder cases. 1. The murder of Dr. Harvey Burdell. Harvey Burdell was born in 1811 in Herkimer County, New York. In his youth, he began his career as a compositor before studying dentistry at his brother John's office in New York. After becoming proficient in the field, he opened his own practice next to his brother's. Although Dr. Harvey Burdell achieved professional success, he struggled financially and faced numerous lawsuits from relatives and others over unpaid debts. In 1835, he became engaged to a young woman from a wealthy family. On the day of the wedding, with the clergyman and guests present, Burdell informed the bride's father that the ceremony could only proceed if a check for $20,000 was provided immediately. Outraged, the father revealed this demand to the guests, leading to Burdell being expelled from the house. Over the years, Burdell accumulated a fortune estimated at $100,000, which included a building at 31 Bond Street in New York. Emma Hempstead was born in New York in 1816. She grew into a striking young woman and was believed to have married George Cunningham in 1835. The couple had 4 children together. When Cunningham passed away in 1852, he left his widow a life insurance payout of $10,000. In 1855, she rented Dr. Burdell's property on Bond Street, while he kept a suite of offices on the second floor. Living with Mrs. Cunningham were her 4 children, a cook named Hannah Conlon, and 3 lodgers, George Snodgrass, Daniel Ullman, and John J. Eckel, the latter of whom seemed particularly friendly with her. On the night of January 30th, 1857, at 10:30 p.m., a man living at number 36 Bond Street was preparing for bed when he heard a cry of "murder" above the sound of the rain pounding against his windows. After that single scream, there was silence. Unable to determine the source of the noise, he eventually went to bed. At 8 a.m. the following day, a boy arrived at Dr. Burdell's office to sweep the floor and light the fire, as was his routine. Upon opening the door, he discovered the doctor's mutilated body on the floor. He ran out screaming and alerted the other residents of the house, who were calmly having breakfast. Mrs. Cunningham appeared to be overwhelmed with grief, while Eckel seemed relatively untroubled. An examination of the body revealed 15 wounds, likely inflicted by a long, narrow dagger. The condition of the room suggested that the doctor, a strong man, had fought fiercely against his attacker. However, a later investigation led authorities to believe that Mrs. Cunningham had likely orchestrated the murder. The day before the murder, a woman visited Burdell's office, and shortly after, he took her, along with the cook, on a tour of the house. Mr. Cunningham was not home at the time, but when the woman returned that evening, she learned about the visit, leading to the following conversation between her and Hannah Conklin, the cook. Woman: "Who was that woman, Hannah, that you showed through the house today?" Cook: "That was the lady who is going to rent the house." Woman: "When does she take possession?" Cook: "On the 1st of May. Woman: "He better watch out. He may not live to sign the papers." Medical experts suggested that the dagger was used by a left-handed person, and Mrs. Cunningham was left-handed. Both she and Eckel were taken into custody. Shortly after her arrest, Mrs. Cunningham presented a marriage license, indicating that she and Burdell had married on October 28, 1856, conducted by Reverend Dr. Marvin. Authorities suspected that she had employed someone resembling Burdell to impersonate him during the ceremony, with the intention that if he were to die unexpectedly, she could claim her share of his property as his wife. While awaiting trial in the Tombs, Mrs. Cunningham came up with a bold plan. Believing that as Burdell's widow she could inherit 1/3 of the estate, she thought that having a child would allow her to claim the entire estate. She then informed Mrs. Foster, the prison matron, that she was in a delicate condition. She was brought to trial, but due to insufficient evidence, she was acquitted. Eckel's charges were dropped without going to trial. After her release, Mrs. Cunningham persisted in her quest for the estate and continued to grow more rotund. Realizing she needed a doctor involved in her scheme, she offered Dr. Ull $1,000 to acquire a newborn child at the right time and to provide an affidavit stating that he attended her during childbirth and that she was the infant's mother. The doctor pretended to agree to the conspiracy while keeping District Attorney Hall informed of all his actions. Dr. Uhl learned of a married woman expecting to give birth around July 28, 1857, and arranged to borrow the baby for a short period. He secured an apartment at 190 Elm Street where the child was born. As soon as possible after the birth, Mrs. Cunningham, disguised as a Sister of Charity, arrived to take the baby in a basket back to her home on Bond Street. She then feigned being very ill and summoned Dr. Uhl. After several hours of moaning and shrieking, it was solemnly announced that the child had been born and that the mother was doing as well as it could be expected. However, District Attorney Hall abruptly disrupted the charade by arriving with a policeman. Shortly thereafter, Mrs. Cunningham found herself genuinely confined in jail, but was later released without going to trial. P.T. Barnum hired both the mother and the child, showcasing them for a brief period at his New York museum. In 1859, Mrs. Cunningham relocated to San Francisco, where she married a retired sea captain. They lived on Geary Street near Kearny, right next to the home of Police Captain Douglas. 2. The murder of Bridget Landrigan and Mabel H. Young. Thomas W. Piper was born on April 22 and hailed from Nova Scotia. He was the second son of farmer T.C. Piper. Initially, Thomas worked as a carpenter on the family farm before relocating to Boston with his family in 1866. While he occasionally helped his father, he sought greater opportunities. Known for his intelligence and literacy, he held various clerking positions throughout the city and was a dedicated member of the Baptist Church, which led to his employment as a sexton at the Warren Avenue Baptist Church. Piper struggled with a kidney disorder, which he managed through a secret addiction to laudanum mixed with alcohol, leading to hallucinations. Unbeknownst to many, he began engaging in acts of arson before committing his first murder. On the night of December 5, 1873, while walking to church in Dorchester with two of his brothers, Thomas Piper suddenly expressed that he wasn't feeling well and wanted to head home. He first stopped at an opium den, mixed the opium with alcohol, and consumed it all before returning home. Afterward, he took a saw and cut off a piece of a shaft, then left the house and wandered around, eventually hiding under a fence. Shortly after, a fire alarm was sounded, and when the noise subsided, Piper stood on the street with his brother and spotted a young woman walking by, Bridget Landrigan, a well-respected domestic servant heading back to her employer's home. The brothers went back inside, with Thomas claiming he was going to bed, but instead he went to the kitchen, grabbed the shaft, and began to follow Landrigan. He stalked her for a while until they reached Columbia Street, where she noticed him. In that instant, Piper struck her with the shaft, causing her to fall, and then hit her again, fatally injuring her by breaking her skull. Before he could do anything with her body, he saw a man approaching and quickly fled the scene. He climbed over a fence along the railroad, taking a circuitous route back home and disposing of a knife he feared could be traced back to him. Several individuals were arrested in connection with the case, including Piper, but he was initially released due to insufficient evidence. A former lover of Landrigan, an Irishman named Thomas Cahill, was extradited from Ireland for questioning. However, detectives found no evidence linking him to the murder, and he soon returned to Ireland, where he was ultimately killed. In 1874, while in downtown Boston, Thomas Piper encountered Tyner, a prostitute on LaGrange Street. They struck up a conversation, and Thomas invited her to a saloon, which she accepted. After sharing some drinks, the two went back to her home, where they soon fell asleep. In the middle of the night, Thomas suddenly awoke, and seeing Tyner asleep, he picked up a hammer-like object and struck her multiple times on the head. He then quickly left through a window and went to sleep in the church for the remainder of the night. Although Tyner survived the attack, she was unable to identify her assailant and was later committed to a lunatic asylum. A former lover of hers named Colby was arrested but was subsequently released due to a lack of evidence. On May 23, 1875, a 5-year-old girl named Mabel Hood Young was attending a service at the Warren Avenue Baptist Church, where Thomas Piper worked as a sexton. Thomas had taken a bat from a lower room with the intent to harm someone and brought it up to the belfry. After the service concluded, he sent away the boys playing in the vestibule and lured young Mabel to the tower by promising to show her the pigeons. Once inside, Piper struck her on the head with the bat several times, causing her to fall. Believing Mabel was dead, he intended to assault her. When he realized she was still alive, he moved the severely injured girl to another location, where she was soon discovered. Piper was arrested, but Mabel succumbed to her injuries the following day. Piper's first trial, prosecuted by Suffolk County District Attorney Oliver Stevens, ended in a hung jury as he consistently proclaimed his innocence. There was insufficient evidence to convict him, resulting in 9 jurors voting for conviction and 3 for acquittal. In his second trial, led by Attorney General Charles R. Train, he was ultimately convicted based on circumstantial evidence. Initially, Piper appeared indifferent in court, but his demeanor changed to one of increasing concern as he returned to his cell. In a hurried letter to his mother, he expressed hope for acquittal, though he believed it unlikely. This attempt to gain public sympathy failed. Before his conviction, his fabricated account of Mabel's murder was initially deemed credible, until he later admitted it was false. Piper had claimed he intended to show Mabel the pigeons, but when he opened a window to let in fresh air, he accidentally left the bat propped against it. Upon returning, he found the trapdoor had fallen on her head. Fearing accusations of assault, he fled downstairs to inform some women about the incident, but remained silent out of fear. The motive for the crime was suggested to be a desire for bloodshed, and under the pressure of the situation, Piper confessed to Mabel's murder. To the shock of the Boston community, he also admitted to other crimes, including the murder of Landrigan, various arsons, the assault on Tyner, and the murder of a girl named Minnie Sullivan. Although there wasn't enough evidence to convict him in those cases, Piper was sentenced to death for Mabel Young's murder. He attempted to appeal his sentence but was unsuccessful. Piper was executed by hanging on May 26, 1876, alongside the Petersham murderer, Samuel J. Frost, in front of at least 300 witnesses. His body was then privately buried at Mount Hope Cemetery. Following his execution, Piper's family requested that his detailed written confession, given to Sheriff John M. Clark, not be made public. Clark agreed, as most of Piper's crimes were already known, and there was a desire to avoid further sensationalizing the horrific deeds of the murderer. 3. The murder of Robert and June Smit. In 1977, South Africa was under the tight control of the apartheid regime, with the South African National Party, which had been elected in 1948, working to institutionalize racial segregation among its citizens. This system, influenced by the Canadian Indian Act, would persist for decades, undermining the rights and values of non-white South Africans. By the 1970s, many nations were boycotting South Africa, and internal conflict had escalated into a political opposition campaign led by the African National Congress and the Azanian People's Organization. Meanwhile, the Pan-Africanist Congress was waging a guerrilla campaign of violence. Robert Smit, a member of the African National Party, attended Pembroke College, Oxford, and Stellenbosch University in his youth. While studying at Oxford in 1958, he married Jane Cora, who was noted for her support and dedication to their 2 children, Liza and Robert Jr. Despite his affiliation with the apartheid government, Liza later stated that her father did not agree with all of its policies. He believed it was unjust to deny the black majority the right to vote, although he supported the government's efforts to distance itself from British rule. From 1971 to 1975, Robert Smit served as South Africa's ambassador to the International Monetary Fund, IMF. Residing with his family in Washington, D.C. upon returning to South Africa, he became the managing director of Santam, an insurance company later revealed to have helped the apartheid regime evade sanctions on military equipment. In November 1977, Robert Smit was campaigning for political office in the Springs constituency as a candidate for the African National Party. The Smits had rented a home in Springs for the election period, making November a particularly busy month as the election approached. On November 22nd, Robert spent the day at his constituency office, while Jeanne visited briefly before going out for the afternoon. She returned home around 6:10 p.m., driven by their chauffeur Daniel, who later testified he last saw her enter their rental home around 6:50 p.m. Between 7:10 p.m. and 7:40 p.m., a call was made from the Smit home to the constituency office. Robert's personal assistant, Sari, answered and informed him that Jeanne had called to say their guests had arrived. It is believed that Robert planned to meet with several prominent members of the anti-apartheid movement that evening. Robert returned home later that night, And it was not until the next morning that the family driver, Daniel, arrived to find a disturbing scene. He immediately called the police. Authorities found Jean slumped over the phone and discovered Robert Smith dead in the lobby. Autopsy results indicated that Jean had been shot in the head, hand, and back, suggesting she had raised her hand in self-defense after being confronted with a gun immediately following her phone call the previous evening. After being shot, Jean was stabbed 14 times with a stiletto knife. The assailants then waited for Robert to return, believed to be between 30 minutes and 3 hours later. As he entered the lobby, they opened fire, hitting him first in the side of the neck, then in the chest, and finally shooting him in the back as he lay on the floor. He was also stabbed in the back once with the same stiletto knife used on Jean. 2 different firearms were used along with the knife, suggesting the involvement of at least 2 attackers. The stabbing of Jean appeared particularly frenzied, potentially indicating personal motives. In an unusual detail, the phrase "Rao Tem" was spray-painted on the kitchen wall. The only item reported missing from the home was Robert's briefcase, which he had taken from his constituency office but has never been found. Investigators later determined that Rao Tem is Afrikaans for a specialized subunit of the Bureau of State Security, BOSS, known for covert operations. Hendrik Vandenberg was the unit's commander at the time and was believed to have ordered the assassination. However, many skeptics question this theory, as the only concrete evidence linking BOSS to the murders was the spray-painted words, created with a can of paint purchased by the Smiths weeks earlier. It seems unlikely that the killers would draw attention to themselves so obviously. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission of South Africa later suggested that the Smiths were likely murdered by members of the security forces, though evidence to support this was scarce. The Motorgate scandal, a political scandal that emerged in the late 1970s, involved the discovery that the then Minister for Information planned to use government funds for a propaganda campaign to support the apartheid regime. Discovered plans included purchasing the Washington Star newspaper, bribing international news organizations, and creating a pro-apartheid publication called The Citizen. While some connections to the Smith murders were proposed, they remained tenuous, primarily based on the timing of the murders and Robert's ties to financial institutions. The investigation into the murders of Robert and Jean Smith remains open to this day.